All right. Well, at this time, I'd like to welcome in my guest, the author of her new book, Unbroken, and it is my guest, MaryCatherine McDonald. Short, she goes by MC, which is a nice little short version. So, but welcome in. I'm really glad that you're here. And I think I said before we got started, I love the book and I've already recommended it to a lot of people, but it's great. So thank you for taking the time to come on.
Oh my gosh, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah. All right. So just so we can maximize our time, something I usually like to do is just because if people aren't familiar with you or haven't heard about the book yet, you can kind of just give us a little bit of background about yourself and kind of what got you into the field and kind of where you're at now with things and just kind of going from there if you want to just start there.
For sure. It's kind of a long, windy road. So
Okay.
buckle up.
Yeah. All right.
I started out researching. I started out in academia and I still have an academic position. I started studying interdisciplinary approaches to really dark things. I got the nickname Dr. Sunshine in the first place that I worked because first I was studying mourning and grief, then I was studying child death, and I was studying suicide, then I was looking at PTSD and combat veterans. And so they were like, okay, Dr. Sunshine, what are you going to look at next?
Right. That's quite the history there.
Yeah. Right. So I've always
hopefully had some fun things to do at the end of the day, like to get out of that a little bit, or no?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no.
Okay.
I mean, I think as you can see, I think that was also part of the nickname is I'm not who you might expect to be in the darkness all the time. You know what I mean? Because I'm pretty smiley and
joke, happy and
a little muppety maybe. So
right.
So I started by studying grief, and I was looking at philosophy and psychoanalysis and sort of the history of the study of grieving. And then I moved into my PhD program and started studying trauma and identity. And then, continued down that academic path. I was writing research papers. I wrote 2 academic books on trauma and the research that I was doing. And I was pulling together 3 different fields. So I was looking at philosophy, neuroscience, and psychoanalysis. And many folks don't know that in the field of philosophy, there's a whole subsection called the philosophy of psychology. And so the specialization that I had in my PhD program was looking at the field of psychology from a critical disposition. So what is going on in the field? What is going right? What is going wrong? How can we reframe things? And I felt that pulling together things in an interdisciplinary way was the best way to get sort of a holistic understanding of anything that we were looking at in mental health. And so I have looked at other things, but I really got inspired when I started researching trauma because there was so much confusion in the field of psychology about what trauma even was, which I was super shocked by. You think, okay, I'm going to go get this scientific understanding from this field that has been studying this since the 1800s. Surely they understand what it is. And I found out really quickly that it was still really up for debate. And so while I was in grad school, I started a coaching practice because number one, I didn't think that I would be able to land an academic job because I was in such a strange interdisciplinary niche. So I had a lot of things working against me in a job market field that is really, really small already. And so I wanted to do some sort of clinical work, but I felt really conflicted about going into clinical work from this critical disposition. So I was in my research kind of tearing apart the field of psychology, and it felt really inauthentic to then just go into it. And so I started a coaching practice, instead as a way of seeing clients and kind of getting information out there and continuing to do my research. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, I realized, okay, I have this academic experience, I have this research experience. Everything that I'm learning is pointing to a couple of central themes about the way that we understand and talk about trauma and triggers and healing. And I have all this, all this experience with clients, all this academic stuff. Why don't I put together a book that will actually reach a wider audience? And so that is where Unbroken came from.
Oh, okay. Great. All right. Yeah. And it's great. And it definitely, you can see the depth and kind of the way that you bring that writing into play. So one of the things that you mentioned, the whole definition of trauma and kind of the convolution there, and, it's kind of moved through its different stages. So where did you land with that as far as how you came to define trauma?
So I reached for a lot of the definitions that I was drawn to were using metaphor, because I think when we reach to try to define something that is as, multi-layered and complex as traumatic experience, words sort of fail us. My mom had a friend who used to say sometimes we fall off the edge of language, like the words just do not match what we are experiencing. And so I found William James described trauma as a thorn in the spirit, which was actually the first title of the book. It was supposed to be called Thorns in Your Spirit. And but then the publisher rightfully was like, nobody is gonna buy that. Like, what does that even mean? And so there's
like, well, if you get into it, you'll know what it means,
right, exactly.
But you just got to give it time, right?
Right. I was like, that's the trick, right? You just give the book a title that doesn't make any sense, and then everyone will want to read it. No,
exactly.
So there's a clinician, Robert Stolero, who works in LA, who's also an interdisciplinary scholar. He uses philosophy and psychology to look at trauma and all sorts of different experience. And he had defined traumatic experience as anything that meets the following two criteria. It has an unbearable emotional affect or experience that lacks a relational home. So number one, you have these unbearable emotions that you can't really process in the way that you process most of the rest of your life. And then two, you don't have a place where you can get help bearing those unbearable emotions. And so the experience in a way gets stuck. And I just found that definition so perfect because I think it does so much work. One of the things I love about it is that unbearable is a bar that's pretty high. Like I can say lots of things about my experience. I got stuck in traffic earlier. It was really frustrating. I ended up being late to something that's kind of annoying. It was hot out. I don't like that. It was unpleasant. There's lots of words I can pick, but I can't really say without a sufficient backstory that that's unbearable.
Right.
Right. Like, and I think that's important because one of the things that is in this kind of discussion and confusion about how we define trauma is this nervousness that if we open it too far and anything is potentially traumatic, then the word essentially becomes meaningless. And I think that's a real concern.
Yeah. The one thing I was thinking though, too, with the unbearable, and I don't know how you feel about this, is like, to me, it does also have some context to it as far as like a personal thing, like what's personally unbearable to you, like where does that fit in? Because it's like, to me, somebody might consider something unbearable, another person might be like, oh, that's just a Friday or something, you know what I mean? Like they don't necessarily maybe see it in the same way, but where does that fit, do you think, as far as that goes? Is that acceptable? Do you see that as okay, or does that make it too convoluted still, or is that?
No, I think if we're going to expect an amount of precision from this that is not going to be offered by the experience, then we need to go with something that's a little bit more open. And I think that, that does a lot of work. And I also think that, so there's been a lot of damage that has occurred in the history of the study of trauma when we don't allow for that ambiguity, where I say, oh, this is my experience, this was really unbearable. And you say, well, that was a Friday. Then typically in the history of the study of trauma, we look at me and say, well, you have weakness of will. There's some underlying condition. There's something wrong with you, that you're too sensitive. And what's much more common, or what's much more true, is that what is unbearable to me right now is going to be different than what's unbearable to you for chemical reasons, for neurobiology, for life experience, for levels of exhaustion, for stress. And also that's true in an individual basis. So what is unbearable to me right now might not be the same as what was unbearable to me before the pandemic.
Yeah. Right.
So it kind of needs to be a moving target, I think.
Right. And I think that's, and I didn't mention this earlier when we were kind of talking about some of the things to share, but I did have this down as like, kind of like looking at how shame kind of finds its way into trauma. And I think that that's a big point for it, or where it can find a space, is that, because I know when clients come in for me and they might use the word trauma and then they'll start to minimize, like, well, maybe I didn't have it that bad or whatever. And it's like, just kind of pause, hold on, like, don't be so quick to judge your experience was your experience, and let's just kind of see where it goes. But I think shame gets in there, and it's like, if somebody heard that definition, an unbearable emotional experience, they might judge themselves as like, well, was it unbearable? Was it not? And then if shame's there, shame's kind of in there punching at them like, you're just, you're a wussy, or what, whatever it might be. Right. But I don't know if you want to speak, because I know you talk a little bit about that in the book, just as far as like how shame finds its way into trauma and kind of keeping us maybe from, dealing with our trauma because we feel that way, right? Like maybe it wasn't really that unbearable or something of that nature, right? Is that kind of
Completely. And I think it's corrosive in so many ways. I'm sure you've seen this with couples as well, where one person in a couple will have a legitimate trauma that's obviously kind of taking itself out on their nervous system, and they will minimize it to their detriment. Or the other partner will say, I have this capital T trauma, you have the lowercase t trauma, so therefore mine is the one that calls the shots. And it's just, that is not going to work, right?
Right, right.
And I think when we try to heal from trauma, and if we have shame in the mix, that's like trying to hike a mountain with your car strapped to your ankle. You're not going to get very far, and you're going to work really hard and not get very far. So I think that the other thing that unbearability does, and this requires a little bit of work on our part, but I think that that's okay, is that it opens the space of temporality, because what was unbearable doesn't necessarily reveal itself in the moment. So to give a simple example, if I picked up a 2-pound weight and I'm deciding I'm going to hold this over my head for this entire conversation, it's a 2-pound weight in itself is not that heavy. And I can probably hold it up. Maybe I actually could hold it up for the whole time that we talk, but it's going to feel a lot heavier the longer that I hold it, not because the weight has gotten heavier, but because of the context, because of the length of time. And so I think sometimes we bear things and we look back because we have the incorrect frame on healing, I think in general, mainly that like there is such a thing as a point of healing where you are done. And so we look back and we say, well, I survived that thing, right? It must have been bearable because I'm here. And the truth is you're still carrying pieces of it. You have remnants that are, weighing heavy on your shoulders. And again, to add shame to that equation is to make things kind of infinitely harder. So I think sometimes it's helpful to take an external perspective on our experience, because, if a little kid came to you and said, my favorite toy just got broken by this bully, it's unbearable. Your first response would not be, oh, no, it isn't. You have no idea. I had got fired at work today. That's unbearable, right? Like that's just not how we relate to each other. And so that shouldn't be how we relate to ourselves. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense. It's yeah. But I think that's the part of like you said, it shouldn't be how we relate to ourselves, but yet we tend to be harder in that way, or not give ourselves the same grace or allowance for things that we do with other people. And that's a pretty common challenge that you face in therapy with people. You mentioned the notion of healing, and I don't know if this is like jumping forward a little bit, but just because you talked about it in terms of like the way that we view healing, I think this kind of gets mentioned in the book too, just as far as like the idea of like what healing looks like. I think even just the notion of like emotions, and people kind of might look at healing as like, well, when I don't have any emotion about the event anymore. I think you've said that, right? Where it's like, then I must be okay. So if you want to just touch on that a little bit, just because you mentioned healing, and as far as like our maybe distortion with that, if that's the right word.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that to do that, we need to talk really quickly about our memory files and how our brain kind of categorizes our experience. And so really briefly, we can go into more detail if you want, but really briefly, our memories get stored in an area of the brain, primarily in an area of the brain called the hippocampus. And each memory file has 3 things in it. It has narrative content, beginning, middle, and end. What happened? Is that coherent? Does it make sense? Emotional content. Was that a funny memory? Is it a joyful memory? Is it bittersweet? Is it sad? Does it bring on anxiety? Whatever the emotional content is. And then it has a set of meaning tags, which help us kind of contextualize it within our larger story arc, right? So your wedding day is going to have a different meaning and importance than that time that you dropped the lunch tray in 4th grade. And each of those memory files is going to have a story, a piece of emotional content, and then the set of meaning tags. And our memory files are supposed to have emotional content. And we don't push on that or question it when it's joy. Like if I tell you a funny thing that happened at work 20 years ago and I start laughing, I don't think, oh, there's something wrong with me because I'm still laughing at that thing that happened 20 years ago, right? Like we just take that as it's fine.
It was a funny time, right?
Right, exactly. It's a funny story. Whenever I tell it, I get the benefit of having that little bolt of laughter and joy. Our traumatic memories, our upsetting memories, our grief memories also have emotional content because they are supposed to. So the goal of healing trauma is not forgetting, and it's not, not feeling. the goal of healing from trauma is integration. So what you're trying to do is get your memory files to look like most of the rest of your memory files so that your brain can find those files when they need them. You can talk about them. You can tell a coherent story about what happened. You can feel some of the emotional content, and then you can put it away. And you can also understand what it means in your larger story arc. When you have an unintegrated memory, that's when we can start talking about triggers, because that's when you have these little fragments that come up that your brain, tries to recontextualize, but then gets kind of cut off by your fear, your stress response. But so the goal of healing is integration, not feeling. When you're asking your brain to stop feeling, you're asking it to do something that it's not supposed to do.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. And it does lead to another question as far as like when people that could be listening, when they hear the word integration, and they might think, okay, well, how do I integrate that memory into my way of being that's not integrated? How do I integrate it? Can you speak on that a little bit as far as like what that might look like? I'm sure that's the whole process of therapy or different things, but like anything specifically you'd say about what that kind of looks like for someone to integrate a new or a memory back into their functionality, I guess, or whatever word we want to use.
For sure. Yeah. So I think from a high level, the three things that you want to do, you want to go in and reorganize that memory file. And so that might look like reorganizing a narrative that may be PC, or maybe it has some fragments missing, or maybe the whole thing is just kind of blank. So you want to reorganize that. You want to deal with some of the emotional content so that it doesn't spill out of the folder. So if I, for example, open the file that contains the morning my father died, I want to be able to tell the story in a way that makes sense. I want to be able to feel some of the grief, but I also want to be able to like stop crying. Like if I tear up while we talk about it, that's very normal, right? But if I'm crying for 3 days, even though it's been so many years since he died, that's an issue, that maybe there's some unbearable emotion there that needs to be held. And I'm trying not to use the word integrated, held and sort of processed with somebody else's brain. Right. And then the last thing, and I think there's tons of hope here, even though I also acknowledge this is really hard, is to kind of reestablish what these things mean in your larger story arc. We don't have any control often, unfortunately, over what happens to us. And we do, though, have control over what it means in our larger story arc. And so I didn't have control over the fact that I lost my father when I was 24, but I can continue to redecide and kind of recontextualize what that means, rewrite those meaning tags on the folder, decide what I'm going to do with it. And so I think there are, as you know, thousands of therapeutic modalities that kind of fit into those three categories and aim at doing some of that or all of that work together. And that could be internal family systems, that could be narrative therapy, that could be EMDR, all of these things that people are talking about a lot recently, and then other modalities that have existed alongside of those things for a long time. But I think the goal is, in general, kind of attacking the memory file in those three spaces.
Right. Okay. So that kind of shifts to something I wanted to touch on. And this kind of goes into the chapter, if people are familiar with the book or they get the book, The Malcolm's Fight Club, which, like, you referenced your dad passing away at a young age. And I can't remember if you used the word in the book, but I just, because I'd read the book Shattered Assumptions, that's the way I internalized it. I think you might have used that term, but it's basically this idea that, for me, a shattered assumption is like, you might think, okay, I'm 24, my dad's going to live till whatever, he's going to walk me down the aisle, he's going to whatever, he's going to be there. And then something like that, a sudden loss hits you, and that shatters that whole worldview or map of the way that I saw my life. Right. And now I have to, recalibrate or regovern or, renegotiate or whatever the word is to, that narrative that I've had that now is broken and doesn't feel like, it's just, it's gone. Right. And we can kind of feel lost without that, because like, okay, this was my map for how I wanted the world to be, and now it's not that way. So that's kind of, I think, what you're saying as far as like, when you talk about that in the book is, that's part of that recalibration, right? That's the narrative side of it, I think, right? The worldview and stuff, if you want to talk a little bit about that. Or
and I think it's you're working in that case with the particular memory file and that particular story, but you're also working over and above that in what does this mean for all of the other files? Like,
Mhm.
because my file system was built on a structure that has just shattered. And
Right.
so how, now what? And I think that's one of the things that we miss so often when we talk about trauma in therapeutic spaces, because so many modalities are built based on this idea that, okay, you have this one singular memory, you just have to integrate it and then move on. But we forget that nothing that happens to us is in a vacuum,
Right.
it
Right.
reverberates through the whole file cabinet in the brain and the whole structure of meaning. And so the language that I use, I think in that chapter, I got from this idea of moral injury, which is when your structures of meaning collapse, and you sometimes then realize for the first time that they were even there and holding the
Mhm.
universe up. And so, as you mentioned, I did not expect to lose my father at 24. I did think he would walk me down the aisle. I thought he would live, well into his 80s, and he was 62. And so it sort of, I was forced to come to grips with this idea that I had this set of meanings, this set of meaning structures that I was using to help understand and navigate the world that then shattered and fell apart.
Mhm.
And so the death of my father is very much about that singular event, but it's also about, now I have to, as you said, renegotiate the whole map. I have to figure out, okay, what structure was there that shattered? What do I want to rebuild? How do I go about doing that? What does that mean for who I am and then how I exist in the world and in other relationships? And I think that's truly like a lifelong path and journey,
Yeah.
because we build these structures and then another piece falls down, and something that we didn't even realize we believed in gets challenged, like
Mhm.
the idea that bad things don't happen to good people, right? That's a very common
Right.
one that we don't really realize is sort of running underneath everything that we do and think, and then something happens that
Something
proves,
happens.
yeah. And so
Yeah.
we're forced to reckon with that, so it really becomes sort of like an existential crisis. And I think that's
Yeah.
something we need to kind of take in more globally if we're going to understand and help people heal from trauma.
Right.
It's not
And
just
I
about
think
the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh, no, go ahead. I can wait.
Last thing, I was just going to say, it's not
Yeah.
just
No.
about the event, it's how that event stamped your world with meaning.
Mhm. Yeah. I think one of the things, and it was probably like the most powerful part, and I've said at the end of that chapter, and I said this to several people, and they're just like, they just kind of like it just catches them, because I think of the impact that it has and the truth that it has, which is basically how to be vulnerable and feel safe at the same time, right?
Mhm.
And to me, it's like, I mean, those two things just have a hard, I mean, vulnerable and feel safe, right? It's like,
Yeah.
and especially after your worldview or whatever that more,
Mhm.
it gets shattered. It's like, well, how do I step on that ground again and
Yeah.
feel like I can have the same level of safety or okayness or trust in,
Mhm.
whatever it is. But that's definitely something that people have to navigate, which I don't know if you have anything you want to share about that, but I just
Yeah.
thought that to me really encapsulated so much about what healing looks like too, or what we have to do in that process of healing, right?
Yeah. The only thing that I've come up with there is this idea that it's it's not a reconciliation of the tension, it's learning to dance with the tension.
Mhm. Yeah.
Because this is something that I struggle with. I was talking to my own therapist just yesterday about that
Yeah.
exact tension, about how to be vulnerable and not constantly be, for me, in, a space of anticipatory grief about who I'm going to lose next, because I've had so
Mhm.
much loss in my life. How do I take those risks? How do I actually show up in that way? Because what I meet is an incredible amount of grief and pain that is invisible, that most people don't think about, or I think lots of people do, but we don't certainly talk about it. And so how do you, my impulse, my younger self wants to just banish that feeling. I just want to be able to connect and be vulnerable and not have that fear. Like that, if I could, wave a magic wand, that's what I would do. But I don't think that that's, unfortunately, something that we get at this point in time. Maybe there will be some advancement in technology and we can do that. But I think in the place of that, then you learn to dance with that tension, and understand that it is a dance, that sometimes you will be leading and sometimes you'll be following, and sometimes the music will be a little bit more fast paced and frantic and you'll lose your footing, and other times you'll feel really great and like you're connecting with some, energy. I don't know
Yeah,
if
no, I
that
love that.
image makes sense outside of my head.
Yeah. No, I love that, because I think that that really kind of helps people too, at least for me, the image of the dance, right? Because it's like that, like you said, even sometimes you'll be leading, sometimes it will be leading, and you
Mm,
just have to try to flow with it the best that you can,
mhm.
and knowing that that's probably all you can do, right? The best that you can. And it's never going to maybe feel 100%. Like there might be moments of like, okay, I feel more
Mm,
comfortable being
yeah.
vulnerable right now.
Mhm.
And there'll be times when I feel less comfortable being vulnerable right now. And some of that might have to do with, I know we haven't really talked about triggers, but we just mentioned it. Some of that might have to do with things that might trigger me that are that hit closer to home with maybe a specific trauma or whatever. Because obviously when that happens,
Yeah.
it's going to be a lot harder to feel that
Mhm.
sense of vulnerability, or allow yourself to be vulnerable, or feel like you can even be safe, because I'm just being, you know,
Yeah.
flooded with a trigger of sorts, right?
Right, right. And then I'm very much like not actually in this space. I'm in the past. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But no, I really like that as far as that goes. I think that hopefully would give people, like, again, a good
Mm.
idea for themselves. Is like it's never, and that goes even to the idea of healing, like it's an end destination, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh,
Mhm.
I'll be healed when I can manage those two tensions in a better way. And it's like it's always going to be a
Yep.
consistent sort of navigation of sorts
Mhm.
to where, those things are at play, right?
Yeah, I
Were you
think one
thinking
of the
something there? Or
things
okay.
that like, if you've ever, I don't know if you've ever tried to learn to dance or if you've ever done this, or I think really
Pretty
anything
terrible at dancing.
that we do with our bodies requires such a huge amount of humility, where we just
Mhm.
say like, yeah, I'm going to stumble. I'm going to go, I'm going to take the class. I'm going to miss some steps. I'm going to love it in some moments. I'm going to hate it. But the key, the thing that I really need to keep going, the one tool that absolutely has to be in the toolbox, is that I don't shame myself relentlessly when I trip, because then you're out. Then the shame
Mhm.
takes over and you can't dance and there's no enjoyment and there's no, and that's, I think, again, like true in any physical activity that you're doing. You have to be a little humble. Otherwise, there's
Yeah,
no way forward. And then
right.
when you are humble, you can say, okay, so I tripped. Okay, so let's step back. Let's take a break. What does that mean? How am I going to recover
Mhm.
from that? How am I feeling? Instead of going to one of two places. One is, why does this keep happening to me? The universe is doing something terrible and I'm, at fault, or I'm, at the mercy of the universe all the time. Or two, it's all my fault and I
Yeah,
am, irreparably broken and need to figure out how to not be in order to move forward, because
yeah.
either of those poles is just not helpful.
Well, and you bring that up, and I mentioned to you before we started talking, just the book that I'd read, Shattered Assumptions, and it kind of
Mhm.
goes into that dynamic of like, how we utilize self-blame as a way of even trying to maintain like a worldview. So even if my worldview is, good
Mhm.
things good things don't happen to, or what is it? What do we say?
Bad things.
Bad things don't happen to
Yeah.
good people, right?
Mhm.
So in order to maintain that worldview, I might say, well, it was my fault that that happened. So
Totally.
therefore I must be bad, or I must be whatever.
Mhm.
Maybe I was thinking I was good, but really I must be bad. And so then it kind of, it helps to maintain that worldview. But then also now we're stuck in a worse place, because we're in this
Mhm.
spiral of self-blame, which doesn't really lead to good things either. So
Yeah.
yeah.
No, and it often leads to repetition. We repeat the
Hmm.
things because when we make them our fault, which again, I think, as you said, it's like you have two pills to choose from. And it's like, well, I at least know what this one's going to do. The shame pill I'm used to. That's something that we become familiar with so young. And so if I can internalize it and make it all my fault, that's a lot more comfortable in some ways, even though that may sound counterintuitive, than coming to grips with the fact that my parents were neglectful, or that
Hmm.
people are maybe evil sometimes and do really violent, inexplicable things. It's sometimes an easier pill to swallow that it's my fault. But the thing that you then miss is all of the other lessons that you could learn about the world when you can understand that from a perspective that says that your parents were neglectful and that's not your fault, you know?
Hmm. Yeah.
Because we so often we are, this is a place we are so, maybe the most relentlessly shameful about, is when we repeat relationship patterns that are destructive. And our behavior becomes inexplicable to ourselves because we say, I know this is bad and I'm repeating it. What the hell is wrong with me? And it's not that there's something wrong with you. It's that this is really complicated. Relationship dynamics are super complicated and there's stuff that hasn't been processed. And if you
Mhm.
can do that and, process that stuff without shame, you're a lot less likely to repeat and repeat and repeat.
Right. Yeah. No, it's good. It's good. Which, this is a totally side note, but I just want to throw it out there because for whatever reason, when you're saying this, it was like, it reminded me of something when you were talking about like the trauma bond aspect of things.
Yeah.
And I really appreciated your slight, I don't know, whatever it was to maybe pop psychology
Yep.
and their version of trauma bonds.
Yeah.
I was like, sweet. I like that. But I felt like your assessment of trauma bonds and kind of the way you defined it and looked, anyway, it made a lot of sense. And I appreciated the definition and kind of the way you viewed it rather than maybe sometimes how it's portrayed. So
Yeah.
anyway, like I said, that was
I'm glad you said that. There's a whole chapter on trauma bonds. Trauma bonds are super important to understand. And the way that they are being depicted on social media right now is like kind of hilarious because it's like, you and I both have been in mental health fields, therefore we're trauma bonded. Like, no, that is not, not what a trauma bond is. It has a real definition. That definition has a history that's actually really fascinating. And a trauma bond is critical to understand so that you can figure out how to get out of it.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to just do you have the definition off what would you, how would you, how did you define it in the book?
So I kind of trace the fascinating history of the trauma bond and how we came to understand it. It comes from the field of understanding domestic violence and why domestic violence was happening in otherwise happy relationships. And there was a whole bunch of bad science that happened for about 20 years. And then these two researchers came around, Donald Dutton and Susan Painter, and they redefined it as kind of an alchemical bond, a very strong bond that has the power to change both people in the dynamic where there's a power imbalance. That's the first part. And the second part is that then one partner intermittently abuses, harasses, or threatens the other. And so it becomes this really complicated power dynamic where there is intermittent abuse, which I think is really important to understand because we do such a terrible job at talking about and understanding domestic violence. And I think a big piece of what we don't understand is that the abuse isn't 100% of the time. It is couched in incredible loving behavior and gestures and promises that this will never happen again and all of this other stuff. And these power dynamics that are acting on both people. And so, yeah, it's a complicated, really sticky thing. In the book, I use the metaphor of rare earth magnets, which are the strongest kinds of magnets. And actually, if you hold them apart, they will sometimes collide with such force that they break apart. And if there's, if you get your hand stuck, it'll break your bones. So it's a tricky
It's
thing.
an intense thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what I like I said, I appreciated it. It definitely has given a lot of context for me and to give that information to other people. But so if you want to learn more about the trauma bond dynamic, the book is a good place for it. So I guess a couple other quick things that I wanted to touch on. One is, I mean, in the book, you also mentioned the notion of like the trigger trap. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that? Like what that is for you, the trigger trap, or what people need to be aware of when it comes to the trigger trap?
Yeah, there's a couple of misconceptions that come up with this idea of being triggered. And I think that the misconceptions arise from so much conversation about triggers. We're using that word so often without any kind of understanding of what it was supposed to mean. And so a trigger was supposed to originally refer to a really unique neurobiological experience where you are in two times at once. And so let's say I'm talking to you and you say a phrase that an abusive partner said to me at some point, and I'm really fighting to stay in this moment and talk to you, but also there's a huge part of my nervous system and brain that is in the past. And so I start to disconnect and lose track of what we were talking about. And I'm feeling anxious and all of these, I really start to get, we use language of like flooding and being taken over and hijacked by your nervous system and your amygdala and stuff like that. And a trigger the reason that they happen neurobiologically is because there are fragments in your memory files that are unintegrated. And so your brain is actually trying to kind of turn on an indicator light that says, hey, there's something here we need to contextualize and work on. And so it throws that memory to the front of your mind when you're in the present, but your fear center recognizes it as dangerous. And so it sets off the full stress response in your body. And so that's what a trigger is, or what it originally was. But we're using it now in a bunch of different ways that are incorrect. And one of them is that we are using the word trigger to kind of as a catch-all for any emotion that is like slightly inconvenient, or negative in any way, right? So I heard when I used to live in LA for a little while, and when I first moved there, it was the fall, and this girl came in and there was no pumpkin spice, like pump stuff or whatever.
Yeah.
And she declared very loudly to the whole store that she had PTSD and she could never return to the Starbucks again because she was so disappointed.
Oh, well,
right.
Shattered assumption.
Shattered assumption. Right.
Right.
And maybe there was like a sufficient backstory where like her, this was the thing she did with her mother every fall, and her mother had just died. And this was I don't actually know, but I'm willing to bet, I think it's probably a reasonable bet, that it was just a use of the term for, hyperbolic effect. She wanted to
announce the fact she's
right.
very disappointed in the lack of pumpkin spice. Yes.
Right. And so when we overuse the word, then we twist its meaning. And so there's a couple of misconceptions that get sort of just kind of looped in here. And one is that we're always aware of our triggers, because I think what we don't realize is that we can be triggered by anything. You can be triggered by fluctuations in your blood pressure that you can't actually really consciously be aware of. You can be triggered by a color. You can be triggered and not have the cognitive knowing that you've been triggered. You just start feeling anxious and you don't know why. And then the second misconception is that triggers are like this signpost that tell you that you should avoid that thing for the rest of your life. Right. So like if I'm triggered by my high heart rate, then I should never exercise. If I'm triggered by people who are angry and fired up, then I can't be on social media. And what's actually happening is, as I explained before, your brain is kind of trying to turn on an indicator light that says, like your indicator light does in your car, something needs work. And so integrating that trigger will stop that symptom. And then again, I think this third misconception, which we talked about a little bit already, is the idea that like when I stop feeling, then I will be healed. We think, I won't have the trigger anymore means I won't feel anything. Yeah. And what's more likely, what you actually want to aim for is to have a kind of an appropriate amount of feeling. Right. And so when something scary happens, you're watching a scary movie, like you're supposed to feel scared. That's okay.
Yeah.
When you take out a file that has fear in it, you can feel a little bit afraid. It's just, does that fear become totally outsized? Does it take over the next 3 days? That's kind of the thing you want to look at.
Right. Just the reduction aspect rather than
exactly
the actual intensity of it or whatever. And that, like you said, you can like feel it and maybe quickly shift into something different, meaning like not like a disconnect or a disassociate, but like more of just like, okay, I felt that, I kind of recognize that for what it is. And now I'm good to keep moving forward or whatever. So
right. Totally. Yeah.
Good. Okay. I like that. So just as we're talking, I was thinking, okay, I think the book kind of like in the way outlined this dynamic. I didn't really put it together until now, but it's like when we talk about those three components, the narrative, the emotional content, and then the label aspect, those are kind of like the chapters definitely have reflection of like those three parts, right? Where it's like there's kind of like the narrative aspect where, maybe you're like,
I didn't even realize.
You're like,
no, I didn't realize.
Oh, okay. And like in Malcolm's part, kind of has like a little bit more of the narrative story. Maybe the girl with the trauma, or the girl that lost the person, and then anyway, I don't know, maybe hers was emotional content.
Sure.
I don't know. But the last one was the label part, right? The label, the tag labels, and kind of what you deal with. And that's Lily's story, which is very, impactful or personal for you, right?
Yeah.
But I thought that was like, to me, it was again great chapter and just great context, because I think even beyond trauma, a lot of times people struggle, and maybe they just don't know that maybe the label they don't recognize the label maybe comes from some type of trauma, but the idea of labels or overcoming things like not good enough or whatever it is. That's a big part of, I think, what people deal with in general. And so I thought that chapter was, very impactful, very amazing. But I don't know if you want to just talk about that dynamic as far as the labels and kind of like subverting, or is that the word?
Yeah,
Our
subverting
power.
power.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I am doing a book club right now on the book where I'm gonna actually rerun it in September if people are interested. But we were just looking at that chapter, the Lily chapter, and someone called it the M. Night Shyamalan chapter of the
Oh,
book,
okay.
which made me laugh because there's sort of the secret reveal, which I won't give away.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, there's this idea in healing where and this again, this is like a dance where we sometimes over identify with our pathologies and we say, okay, so I've been diagnosed with PTSD, and so this is what I am. And I've heard
Mhm.
so often in the last couple of months, clients say, well, my whole personality is a trauma response.
Mm.
And everything that I have built is a trauma response, which is in some sense true because your trauma response is an adaptation to your environment and your experience. And at the same time, it's not everything that you are. So
Yeah.
one of the things that trauma tricks us into thinking is that the trauma story is the only story.
Mhm.
And the pathology or the label is the only thing about us. And it becomes this negativity bias where we see ourselves. So if you label yourself as anxious or someone who has PTSD, then all you see is the anxious behavior. All you see are the PTSD symptoms. And there's an exercise in the book, which I can give away just a little bit because it's one of
Yeah.
my favorite ones, where you put those labels down, right? Like you're anxious,
Mhm.
you have PTSD, whatever else, the listener will know their labels because they will come to mind right away. And then you put those down on paper. You think about how they make you feel, seeing them listed like that. And then you write down 100 other things that you are right next to those labels. And it can be tiny, like you're someone who drinks LaCroix. You're someone who has 3 pairs of Vans. You're someone who is a mountain biker, like whatever they are. And the result is that you fill your picture out and you see that, yes, these labels may be true, but they are so far from all that you are that it's almost absurd.
Mhm. Yeah. I hope, I mean, I know there'll be some people listening that are like, oh, that's why he gave me that exercise, but I definitely give you credit because I've given it out
Oh,
several times.
I don't even care.
And
Just give it
no,
out.
I do give you credit because I'm like, okay, this comes from this book,
Thank
Unbroken.
you.
It's great. I love because like you said, it's like, it's really hard for people to come outside of that identity. And those
Yeah.
labels are so, even if they just come up with a list of 4 or 5, it's like those 4 or 5 things are so impactful to them. And
Mhm.
that's kind of just what they gravitate to, as opposed to all the other stuff that they are, or can be, or not even
Totally.
can be, because it's what they are.
Yep.
They just don't see it, right? They
Yep.
don't see those aspects of things. And the other thing I thought was interesting about that's even helped me, is when you talk about just the engagement with that label, and
Mhm.
how, like, even when you're saying, well, okay, I'm going to prove that I'm good enough, but you're still
Mhm.
engaged with the label, right?
Right.
And I think for me,
Yes.
it was kind of like a little bit of light bulb, even though I probably understood that, but just hearing it, reading it was like,
Mhm.
oh yeah, you can't, in that case, you don't even want to dance with that, right?
Right.
You want to just be, okay, kick that over here. And I'm
Mhm.
just being me. I want my own identity, and I don't want my identity to be based on whether or not I am good enough or not good enough, or if I'm proving it wrong
Mhm.
or whatever. I would just want it to be what it
Mhm.
is. So I thought that was really, I did that come up in research, or is that just something you like came up with as far as things, or how did you, or just what you saw, I guess, with that?
Yeah, no, it was just what I was seeing with my clients, and I was seeing, and also with myself. We're living in kind of a strange time because people are
Hmm.
so much more likely to talk about their own mental health struggles publicly, which is
Yeah.
amazing. That's a great, wonderful thing. But we're kind of doing this strange thing where it becomes almost like a kind of social currency. The more struggle you have, the
Hmm.
more legitimate you are. And I think that pushes us to over identify with these stories and then get really stuck.
Hmm.
Because if the story you're telling yourself about yourself is that the only important thing about you, or the only story about you is that you have trauma or anxiety, then you get to a healing ceiling pretty quickly, and you can't really break out of that, because to do so would then be to let go of your identity, which is
Hmm.
really terrifying, right? That's like ego death.
Yeah.
And so so I was seeing that over and over with clients and thinking like, okay, so if we over engage with this, we run into problems. And if we rebel against them and make our whole personality about rebelling against these things, it almost just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because we just
Yeah.
end up over identifying with them from the place of rebellion, which is also not helpful.
Right.
And so it was like, how can we reconcile these things, but not make them our whole being? And I think I came up with this honestly, like off the top of my head in a group because I was frustrated. And I was like, yes, those
You
things are
people.
right. Oh my God. Yes, you're anxious.
Right.
Okay, I hear you. Write that down. Now write 100 other things you are,
Uh-huh.
And we did it live in a group and it was just like, oh wow, that's,
Yeah.
holy crap. Like, yeah, okay, sure, I'm anxious, but like, look at all the other things on the page that I am. Like, that
Right.
is such a small thing in comparison. So
Right. Right. And
yeah.
if I'm, like I said, and if I'm just trying not to be that anxious person or
Right.
whatever, it's still like I'm
It
still
still owns
defining.
you.
Yeah, it's still
Mhm.
right. 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 So yeah, no, I thought that was great. And just like the idea of like subverting that power and kind of, you know,
Mm,
I use the term even just taking your power back and being able
yep.
to like, be in charge of the bus and, drive the bus in
Mhm.
the way that you want it and not the way the label is trying to tell you to go or what you are or what you aren't. So
Yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah.
yeah,
Can I
very,
tell the Muhammad Ali story really
yeah,
quick?
yeah, it's great. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Muhammad Ali was set to fight George Foreman, and George
Mhm.
Foreman was known to be just a lot stronger than Ali. And this was the Rumble in the Jungle. I think it was like
Mm.
1970 or something, 1968. And people were actually afraid that Ali was going to die. Like, they weren't just afraid that he was going to lose the fight, but that Foreman was so much stronger that he wasn't actually going to physically make it. And so Ali came up with this method that is now called rope-a-dope, where he leaned back against the ropes and he just let Foreman wail on him. He protected his face and his, important parts. And then anytime he felt like he could get a shot in, a really good one, he would get it in, but otherwise he would just let Foreman wail on him. And then at the end, when Foreman got exhausted, as you do when you're hitting with all of this energy and strength, he hit him with a combo and knocked him out, and he actually won the fight. And so he went from this position of like underdog might die to actually winning the fight, which seemed physically impossible, because in a sense it was physically impossible. But
Mhm.
the way that he won, the way that he took the reins back, as you say, or subverted the power, was by accepting the facts. He was
Yeah.
not going to become as strong as Foreman. It was impossible.
Right.
And he could have kind of shrunk into shame and said, I'm not as strong and I'm getting older and I'm not I'm a has-been. And that would have been a really easy route. And then he would have lost for sure in 2 seconds, lost the fight. But instead he accepted what was and took the power back by figuring out what else was there. Yeah, he's not as strong
Yeah.
as Foreman, but he's really clever. And so he came up with a clever way around it. And
Mm.
I'm obsessed with that story because
Yeah, I
it's,
love it. The other thing I point out to people too is and you might as well just, but I point out to people that he also didn't try to prove himself
yes,
strong, right?
right.
He didn't try to prove himself against the belief, right? Like, oh,
Mhm,
people are saying I'm not as powerful. I'm going to show them I'm going to be as
mhm.
powerful. Like, he didn't go that route either, because the same way you end up in the same result, where if you
Yep,
go that path, you're going to lose anyway or whatever, because you won't be as powerful, and then the label will fit or whatever.
totally.
So like you
Yeah.
said, I think there's, yeah, anyway, that part spoke to me as well too. Like, he didn't get into that boxing match with the belief where it's like, I'm going to prove myself to be this way. And and yeah, so I think that's a great analogy for that, and it kind of covers all those bases. And he just was okay and created his own identity for himself,
Mhm.
and it was one of the greatest things, boxing matches in history. And then Rocky stole the idea and did it against Mr. T, and
Oh, I didn't even know that.
it's pretty much what he did. The same thing in the second
Oh,
fight.
that's
He
funny.
he just took a beating from him for a couple rounds, and then he got tired, and then he beat him. So yeah.
Boom. I love it.
For anybody that's more on the Rocky side of things, it's like it's the same theory.
You got to
It worked.
repeat. Yeah,
Yes, got
exactly.
it. Right. All right. Well, I really, again, just appreciate you coming on. I love the book. Or anybody that's, looking for a good read, it's a great read. And the thing
Thank you.
that's, I mean, even just in talking to you today, I mean, hopefully people realize the book is similarly written. I don't find it complicated and find it like too, like, what's the word, academic or anything like that. Is very
Yeah.
readable for
Mm,
anybody. And so that was a great way of doing it, because I think sometimes that can be a challenge for some people to have a book speak to everybody, versus like, getting the technical part out there, but then,
Then it's like a textbook and no one
yeah,
can get through it.
right. No, this was great. So I
Oh,
think
thank
people
you.
really enjoy it. So,
Yay.
but yeah, again, thanks for coming on, and it was great to meet you, and best of
Thank you
luck
so
with the
much.
book and
Thank you so
everything.
much for having
Are
me.
you
It was fun.
doing, besides the book, is there any other things that people can maybe find you on or anything?
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
really exciting things coming. So I'm on Instagram at mc.phd and also TikTok mcphd, and I have a website alchemycoaching.life, and I'm going to be starting more classes in the fall
Okay.
that are based on these things and other things that I'm working on and writing on, that I would love to have people come and join if they're interested.
Yeah. Great. All right. Okay. Well, I'll put that in the show notes, and
Awesome. Thank you.
we'll make sure we get that out there. So,
Cool.
all right. Thank
Thank
you
you so
again.
much.
All right. Oh, yeah.